September of 1982, in a fold of the Appalachian foothills known as Silas Creek Hollow, the land was tired. The problem was not the soil itself, which was a rich, dark loam in the bottomlands and a thinner, but still serviceable clay on the slopes. The problem was the shape of the land and the memory of water. For 3 generations, the hollow had been defined by its terraces, 67 distinct levels carved into the steep northern and southern faces by Alara's great-grandfather. They were marvels of manual engineering, each one between 12 and 20 feet wide, held in place by dry-stacked stone walls and the dense root systems of ryegrass and clover. They were designed for a world of walking plows and mule teams, a way to make productive use of land that a modern farmer would deem unfarmable. Alara Gable saw the failure of these terraces not as a single event, but as a slow, creeping erosion of purpose. She was 68 years old, a woman whose frame seemed to have been shaped by the land itself. Lean, durable, and weathered. Her hands were maps of 60 years of work, the knuckles swollen, the palms calloused, but the fingers still nimble enough to mend a harness or shell piece. She lived in the same clapboard house her grandfather, Silas, had built from white oak milled on the property. She was debt-free, a status so rare in the county it was spoken of with a mixture of awe and suspicion at the co-op in town. The terraces were dying. After the war, her father, like so many others, had been lured by the promise of the tractor. He had bought a Ford 8N, a fine machine for the flat bottomland along the creek, but a clumsy and dangerous liability on the slopes. He had tried to work the lower terraces with it, but the narrow paths crumbled under the rubber tires, and the weight of the machine compacted the soil into a dense, lifeless hardpan. After a near rollover in the spring of 1953, he had abandoned the hillsides altogether. For 30 years, the terraces had been left to themselves. Scrub pine and blackberry briars had taken root, their tendrils prying apart the stones of the retaining walls. The intricate drainage channels Silas had dug by hand were choked with silt and leaves. Water, no longer guided in gentle, meandering paths, now cut straight down the slope, carving deep gullies that bled topsoil into Silas Creek with every heavy rain. The insurmountable problem, as the county saw it, was economic. The bottomland, a mere 30 acres, was not enough to sustain the farm against the rising costs of fuel, fertilizer, and seed. The 200 acres of terraced hillside were considered a liability, a scenic ruin. Several times, men from timber companies had come by, offering to clear-cut the slopes. They spoke of board feet and pulpwood prices, their eyes scanning the mature oaks and hickories without ever seeing the stone walls hidden beneath the undergrowth. Alara had always sent them away. The hollow was not a collection of assets to be liquidated. It was a single, integrated system, and the terraces were its bones. The history of failure was well known in the valley. A decade earlier, her neighbor to the east, a younger man named Henderson with more ambition than sense, had tried to reclaim his own terrace slopes. He had leased a bulldozer, a Caterpillar D6, and had simply pushed the terraces flat, creating a single, steep, and unstable grade. He had planted it with corn, and the first thunderstorm had washed away half his topsoil and all of his seed. The hillside was now a barren scar of red clay and deep gullies, a permanent testament to the folly of fighting the land's nature. The community had accepted the lesson. The hills were for trees and nostalgia, not for farming. They were a problem with no modern solution. Into this accepted state of decay came a man named Mark Renshaw. He was from the State University's Agricultural Extension Program, but he worked more like a consultant for the large agricultural banks that were beginning to consolidate their hold on the region. He drove a new Ford F-150, a truck so clean it seemed to repel the dust of the county roads. He wore a pressed shirt, creased trousers, and carried a slim leather briefcase. He was 35, with a confident smile and a way of looking at a piece of land as if it were a column of figures on a spreadsheet. Renshaw had been sent by the regional bank that held the loans for most of the farms in the surrounding counties. They were performing a viability assessment of the entire region, and Alara's debt-free status made her an anomaly, a data point that needed to be understood and, if possible, corrected. He walked the perimeter of her bottomland fields, taking soil samples with a chrome-plated auger. He made notes on a clipboard. His movements were efficient, his gaze analytical. He measured, he calculated, he did not observe. He stood with Alara at the edge of the creek, looking up at the decaying terraces. "It's a shame," he said, his tone a blend of professional sympathy and dismissal. "A lot of work went into that, once upon a time, but it's non-productive acreage. From a modern asset management perspective, the carrying cost of the land taxes outweighs its productive potential." Alara said nothing. She watched a hawk circle high above the ridge, its movements dictated by currents she could feel but not see. Renshaw continued, flipping a page on his clipboard. "The optimal strategy here would be a managed timber harvest on the slopes. You could realize a significant one-time capital gain. Reinvest that in upgrading your equipment for the bottomland, a new combine, maybe a no-till planter. We could get your yield per acre up by 12% within 2 years. Alternatively, the acreage itself has development potential. Subdivide the hills into 5-acre lots for weekend cabins. The view is good." He looked at her, expecting a response. Her silence seemed to unnerve him slightly. "Miss Gable," he said, softening his tone, "I understand there's a sentimental attachment, but farming is a business now. You're sitting on 200 acres of fallow land. My job is to show you how to make it work for you." "It works," Alara said. Her voice was quiet, raspy from disuse. Renshaw gave a small, polite laugh. "Well, it's certainly holding the hill up. For now. But it's not generating revenue. The gullies are getting worse. In another 10 years, the erosion could threaten your bottomland. The smart move is to act now, control the process." He pointed his pen at the highest, most overgrown terrace. "There's no machine made that can work a slope that steep on a ledge that narrow. It's a museum piece." He closed his clipboard with a decisive snap. He offered a solution that was expensive, destructive, and utterly alien to the logic of the hollow. He saw only problems and costs. He could not see the design. He saw the past as a mistake to be erased, not a lesson to be understood. The next week, the talk at the county co-op was all about Alara Gable. Dale, the manager, leaned on the counter next to the register. Mark Renshaw from the university was out to see her, he said to a small group of farmers nursing coffee from styrofoam cups. Said her place is a ticking time bomb of erosion. Told her she ought to timber it. Tom Haskins, a man whose family had farmed the next valley over for a century, shook his head. She won't do it. Stubborn as her grandfather. Silas would have sooner cut off his own arm than sell a stick of timber off that hill. Stubborn don't pay the bills, another man chimed in. Though I guess she ain't got any. This was said with the grudging respect reserved for the truly independent. The conversation would have ended there, another minor piece of local gossip, had it not been for the news that followed a month later. Alara Gable had been at the livestock auctions. Not just the local one, but the big ones in Roanoke and even up in Pennsylvania. She wasn't buying cattle. She wasn't buying hogs. She was buying mules. Old mules. The first report came from a man who had seen her at an auction in West Virginia, outbidding a logging company for a match pair of 16-hand Belgian draft mules. Then another story surfaced. She had bought a whole dispersal herd of 20 animals from an Amish farmer whose sons were switching to tractors. The numbers grew with each telling, becoming more and more outlandish. Dale finally got the true story when the first of the livestock trucks arrived. He saw it himself, a long, double-decker trailer turning carefully onto the narrow road to Silas Creek Hollow. He called Alara that evening, ostensibly to ask if she needed any extra feed. "Heard you were stocking up," he said, trying to sound casual. "I am," Alara's voice said over the line. "How many head did you end up with?" Dale asked. There was a pause. 80, she said. Dale was silent for a long moment. He did the math in his head. 80 mules. The feed bill alone would be staggering. The amount of work required to care for them was unthinkable for one woman, even one as capable as Alara Gable. It was madness. It was financial suicide. 80, he finally managed to say. "That's right," Alara said, and then she politely ended the call. The news spread through the county like a grass fire. 80 mules. The men at the co-op no longer spoke of her with grudging respect. They laughed. It was a sad, pitying kind of laughter. They imagined the old woman, alone in that hollow, surrounded by a herd of useless, hay-burning relics. They pictured her trying to manage them, to work them. It was the punchline to a joke they all understood. She had chosen 80 old mules over a tractor, over progress, over sense. She had finally, in her old age, lost her mind. Mark Renshaw, when he heard the news on a subsequent visit to the county, just shook his head with a weary smile. A passion project, he called it, the term a clinical dismissal. Ashamed to see someone pour their resources into a dead-end technology, the community echoed his assessment, reinforcing Alara's isolation and the perceived foolishness of her path. The laughter was a wall she did not even seem to notice. Alara did not hear the laughter. Or if she did, it was a distant sound, like the drone of a highway from a quiet field. Her focus was on the past, on a set of principles that existed outside the logic of spreadsheets and bank loans. Her knowledge was not her own. It was borrowed, a legacy held in trust. As the first teams of mules were unloaded into the expanded paddock she had spent the last month fencing, she went into the house and opened the bottom drawer of Silas's old roll-top desk. Inside was a set of 6 leather-bound ledgers. The leather was cracked and worn smooth at the corners. The paper inside was thick, yellowed, and filled with her grandfather's precise, angular script. These were not diaries. They were records. Decades of rainfall, soil temperature, crop rotations, and detailed notes on the construction and maintenance of every single terrace on the farm. But the most important ledgers were the ones dedicated to the mules. She pulled one out. The cover was embossed with the years, 1920 to 1935. She opened it to a page from 1928. Her grandfather's voice seemed to rise from the ink. Silas had been her mentor, a quiet, powerful man who had taught her to read the land as if it were a book. He had lost a leg in the Great War, and it was the mules that had allowed him to continue farming. He couldn't handle the clutch on the early tractors, but he could sit on a stone boat or a wagon and guide a team with his voice in his hands. He understood them not as beasts of burden, but as partners. She remembered standing with him on the highest terrace, looking down at the hollow spread below. She had been a girl of 10. Most people look at this hill and see a problem, Silas had said, his hand resting on the smooth, worn handle of his hickory walking stick. They see a fight. They want to flatten it, conquer it. They think the shortest line is a straight 1 inch he had pointed with his stick to the gentle curve of the terrace they stood on. But the hill gives you the path. The water shows you the way down without a fight. A mule understands that. It won't fight the hill. It'll find its footing. It'll lean into the work, but it won't break itself or the land. This was the core principle. The hill gives you the path. It was a simple, powerful truth that governed everything in the hollow. The terraces were not an imposition on the landscape. They were in agreement with it. They followed the natural contours, slowing the water, holding the soil, creating life where there would otherwise be only erosion. A tractor, with its rigid axle and brute force, could never understand this agreement. It could only impose its will, and on a steep hill, the hill's will was always stronger. Alara turned the pages of the ledger. Silas had recorded the name, lineage, and temperament of every mule that had ever worked the hollow. Jude, strong but lazy on the left trace. Needs a steady partner. Good with a scraper. Bell, smart, learns a new command in a day. Doesn't like mud. He had notes on their feed consumption relative to work output, calculations on the precise angle of draft needed for a walking plow on a 15-degree slope, and diagrams of the complex, multi-team hitches needed to pull a stone boat for clearing rocks. This was the physical manifestation of her knowledge. It was not a theory. It was a vast collection of empirical data gathered over a lifetime of trial and error. Silas had understood that the farm was a closed system. The mules ate the oats and hay grown on the terraces. Their manure fertilized the soil that grew the hay. Their power repaired the terraces that held the soil. It was a slow, regenerative cycle that required patience and observation, two qualities that had no place on a modern balance sheet. Renshaw had called the Mules a dead-end technology. Silas had written in 1932 after a visit from the first tractor salesman in the county. He says his machine makes the work fast. I told him I'm not in a hurry. The hill is not in a hurry. The work is not to be finished, but to be continued. The mule is a continuation. Alara closed the ledger. The decision to buy the 80 mules was not madness. It was math. She had walked the 67 terraces. She had measured the length of the collapsed stone walls. She had calculated the cubic yards of soil that had eroded into the gullies. She knew, from Silas's records, the number of mule hours required to move 1 cubic yard of earth with a slip scraper. She knew the optimal number of teams needed to work simultaneously without getting in each other's way. She needed 10 teams for earth moving, 5 for hauling stone, and 2 for lighter cultivation and transport. Each team was 2 mules. That was 34 mules working on any given day. Mules, like men, needed rest. A 3-day rotation, 1 day of work, 2 of rest, was the most sustainable. 34 working, 68 resting. That was 102. She had settled for 80. It would be slower, but it was a start. The math did not require a pencil. It required a memory. Armed with this hidden knowledge, Alara began to act. The process was as quiet and methodical as her decision-making. The 80 mules were not a homogeneous herd. They were a curated collection of experience. She had bought them from dozens of sources: dispersal sales, old loggers, Amish families, even a few from a tourist carriage company that was upgrading its stock. They ranged in age from 8 to 20. She had favored the older, calmer animals, the ones with the wisdom of years of work in their eyes. There were Belgians and Percherons for the heavy pulling, smaller Appaloosa mules for their sure-footedness on narrow ledges, and a few Mammoth Jacks and Spanish Jennets for future breeding. Her grandniece, Lena, arrived in the second week. Lena was 20, a quiet, serious young woman who had grown up in the city but had spent her summers in the hollow. She had her great-granduncle's observant eyes. She arrived without being asked, her belongings in a single duffel bag. She saw the mules, looked at Alara, and simply said, "What do we do first?" The first task was sorting. For a week, Alara and Lena simply watched the mules in the large pasture. Alara carried one of Silas's old ledgers, making notes. She observed their social hierarchy, their gaits, their temperaments. She looked for natural pairs, animals that seemed to move together, to trust each other. She was not just building teams, she was building relationships. Then came the work of harness and equipment. The old mule barn, which had stood empty for 30 years, was a dusty museum of the technology Renshaw had dismissed. Alara and Lena spent days cleaning and oiling the old leather harnesses. They dragged out the strange, forgotten tools: slip scrapers, walking plows, stone boats, and a heavy, iron-toothed device called a V-drag for clearing ditches. Each piece of equipment was simple, heavy, and brutally effective. It was all designed to be pulled by animals and operated by a single person. There were no complex mechanical parts to break, no engines to flood, no fuel to buy. The community watched this preparation with a sense of morbid curiosity. Cars would slow down on the county road that ran past the mouth of the hollow, their occupants staring at the sight of the huge herd of mules grazing in the expanded pasture. It was a vision from another time, an anachronism so profound it was unsettling. The consensus at the co-op remained firm. It was a spectacle, a folly, the last act of a woman who had lost touch with the modern world. The real work began in late October. Alara chose her first team, a pair of steady, 20-year-old gray Percheron mules named Luke and Gabe. She hitched them to a slip scraper, a simple, scoop-like implement that had been used to build the Panama Canal. The process was a slow, deliberate ballet of animal power and human guidance. Alara would walk behind the scraper, her hands on the 2 wooden handles. With a quiet command, "Step up, boys," she would signal the mules to move forward. As they walked, she would lower the handles, causing the cutting edge of the scraper to dig into the earth. It would fill with a few 100 pounds of soil. Then, with a flick of her wrists, she would lift the handles, and the loaded scraper would slide along the ground. She guided the team to a section of collapsed terrace wall, flipped the scraper over to dump the load, and then returned for another. It was brutally hard, repetitive work, but it was also precise. With each pass, she was not just moving dirt. She was re-establishing the gentle, life-saving slope of the terrace. She was not fighting the hill. She was healing it. Lena learned quickly, starting with a smaller, lighter team, her movements eventually becoming as fluid and economical as Alara's. They started at the bottom, on the lowest terrace, clearing the largest gully first. It was a wound in the earth 20 feet deep and 50 feet wide. Day after day, for weeks, 10 teams of mules worked in a slow, circling procession. The lead teams scraped soil from the high ground. The swing teams hauled it to the gully. The wheel teams, hitched to stone boats, dragged rocks from the creek bed to begin rebuilding the retaining wall. The sounds of the work filled the hollow. Not the roar of an engine, but the jingle of trace chains, the creak of harness leather, the low-spoken commands of the two women, and the steady, rhythmic plodding of hooves. It was a quiet, organic sound, a sound that seemed to belong to the land itself. Skeptics who drove by saw only the slowness of the process. They saw a few tons of earth moved in a day, a task a bulldozer could accomplish in an hour. They saw two women and a herd of animals engaged in what looked like a pointless, archaic ritual. They did not see the fine network of feeder roots the mules' hooves left undisturbed. They did not see the way the soil, moved in small increments, settled naturally, without the deadly compaction of heavy machinery. They did not see the worms and microbes in the earth that were being preserved, not crushed. They saw the method, but they did not understand the principle. They saw the work, but they could not imagine the outcome. By the first week of December, the great gully on the lowest terrace was filled. A new stone wall, rough but strong, stood in place of the breach. Alara and Lena had seeded the newly moved earth with winter rye, its green shoots already beginning to show a fragile promise against the coming cold. They had repaired one small part of the system. They had 66 terraces to go. It was the work of a lifetime, and it had begun. The winter came on fast and hard that year. It began not with snow, but with ice. A week before Christmas, a slow-moving front of warm, moist air from the Gulf collided with a mass of Arctic air that had slid down from Canada. The result was a steady, freezing rain that fell for 2 solid days. It coated everything in a clear, heavy sheath of ice. Tree branches, weighted beyond their limits, cracked and fell with reports like rifle shots. Power lines, thick as a man's arm with ice, snapped and coiled on the roads. The entire county and most of the state went dark. Then the snow began. It was a fine, dry snow, driven by a relentless wind that sculpted it into deep, impassable drifts. For a week it fell, burying the ice-entombed landscape under a blanket of white 3 feet deep. The radio, powered by a battery in Alara's kitchen, called it the storm of the century. The governor declared a state of emergency. The roads were closed. Fuel trucks could not get through. The generators at the co-op and the gas station ran until their diesel tanks were dry, and then they fell silent. The modern world, with its intricate and fragile supply chains, ground to a halt. In the towns, people huddled in their homes, their furnaces dead, their pipes freezing. On the farms, men looked at their powerful, expensive tractors, now inert lumps of cold steel, their fuel tanks nearly empty, with no hope of a refill. The silence that settled over the county was profound. It was a silence defined by the absence of engines. But in Silas Creek Hollow, the work continued. The mules were unbothered by the cold. Their thick winter coats protected them from the wind, and their calm dispositions were untroubled by the storm. The vast stores of hay and oats Alara had stockpiled in the barn were more than enough to keep them fed. The creek, insulated by a layer of snow, still ran freely, providing water. The first sign of success was subtle. The day after the snow stopped, Alara and Lena hitched a team of 4 mules to a heavy log. They dragged it up and down the long driveway to the county road, clearing a path. Then they did the same for the lane that led to the barn and the pastures. While the rest of the county was snowbound and paralyzed, Alara's farm remained fully operational. A few days later, Tom Haskins' son appeared at their door. He had walked 2 miles through waist-deep snow. His family was out of heating oil, and their propane tank was empty. His father was sick, and the house was dangerously cold. He asked if Alara had any firewood to spare. Alara nodded. She and Lena hitched a team to a large sled they had built on a set of old wagon runners. They spent the morning loading it with seasoned oak and hickory from the woodshed. The mules, their footing sure even in the deep snow, hauled the half-ton load to the Haskins farm, creating a packed trail behind them. They returned for a second load, and a third. By evening, the Haskins family had enough wood to last a month, and a clear path had been broken between the 2 hollows. The news, passed by the few who had working CB radios, rippled through the frozen community. Alara Gable was not isolated. She was mobile. Her dead-end technology was the only thing moving in the entire county. Mark Renshaw was stranded in the county seat, staying at the only motel, which had a large backup generator. He had been there for a routine follow-up on his regional assessment when storm hit. For a week, he had been poring over his data, frustrated and bored. When he heard the reports about Alara, he was skeptical. He assumed it was an exaggeration, a piece of local folklore being born out of desperation. On the 10th day of the freeze, the county's emergency coordinator came to the motel. The doctor's 4-wheel drive truck was stuck in a drift a mile from the Haskins place, where Tom's sickness had worsened into pneumonia. The plows were useless in the deep, icy drifts. There was no way to get to him. Someone remembered the path the mules had made. Renshaw, intrigued, put on his coat and walked with the coordinator to the edge of town, where the plowed road ended. They stood there, helpless, looking out at the buried landscape. And then they saw it, a dark shape moving against the white of the distant hills. As it grew closer, Renshaw could make out the details. It was a team of 4 mules pulling the big sled. Alara was driving them. They were bringing Tom Haskins out. Renshaw stood in the biting wind, his clipboard and spreadsheets forgotten. He watched the mule team approach, their movements steady and powerful, their breath pluming in the frigid air. They were not struggling. They were working. They moved with a quiet, inexorable purpose that was a stark contrast to the paralyzed machinery of the modern world. He watched as they brought the sled to a gentle stop, and the doctor was able to get Tom Haskins into an emergency vehicle. He saw Alara, her face wrapped in a wool scarf, give a quiet nod to the emergency coordinator before turning her team around and heading back the way she came. In that moment, Renshaw was forced into a silent, profound reevaluation. He had assessed Alara's farm in terms of yield, efficiency, and revenue. He had measured it against a set of metrics that had been rendered completely meaningless by a change in the weather. He had seen her 80 mules as a liability, a drain on resources. But now he saw them for what they were, 80 independent, self-fueling all-terrain engines. They were a living, breathing solution to a problem his own world had no answer for. His initial assessment had not just been wrong. It had been fundamentally blind. He had looked at the hollow and had failed to see the most important thing, its resilience. The climax of Alara's vindication was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, dawning realization across the entire community. As the freeze continued into its 3rd week, the path broken by her mules became a lifeline. They hauled feed to stranded cattle, delivered medicine and groceries, and transported people who needed to get to the emergency shelter in town. Lena, now a confident teamster, often drove a smaller team on her own, her quiet competence earning the silent respect of men who had once laughed at her gray tant's folly. The work on the terraces had not stopped. When they were not hauling supplies for others, Alara and Lena were back on the hillsides. The frozen ground was hard, but the mules could still gain purchase with their cleated hooves. They used them to drag away the hundreds of fallen trees and branches that littered the slopes, clearing the paths for the spring. The work was slow, but it was constant. While every other farm in the county had lost 3 weeks of productivity, Alera's operation had not missed a single day. The success was absolute and undeniable. When the thaw finally came and the fuel trucks began to roll again, the world of engines roared back to life. But something had changed. The laughter was gone. In its place was a quiet, grudging admiration. The story of the 80 Mules had become a local legend, a tale told with a new understanding. Renshaw's reevaluation was quantified not just by observation, but by a new set of calculations he began to make in his motel room. He estimated the cost of the fuel that would have been required to do what Alera's Mules had done for the community: the plowing, the hauling, the transport. The figure was enormous. He calculated the economic losses incurred by the other farms due to the shutdown, a number that ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars for the county. Alera's losses were zero. He looked at his initial report, with its recommendations for timber harvesting and equipment upgrades. He had proposed a system based on high inputs and high outputs, a system that was incredibly efficient in ideal conditions. But the storm had revealed its fatal flaw. It was utterly fragile. It was dependent on a long and vulnerable chain of external resources. Alera's farm, by contrast, was an almost entirely closed system. It was less efficient by his old metrics, but it was infinitely more durable. He had been trained to maximize profit. Alera and her grandfather had designed a system to maximize survival. 2 weeks after the roads cleared, Mark Renshaw's Ford F-150 appeared at the mouth of Silas Creek Hollow. This time, he did not drive up to the house. He parked on a road and walked. The driveway, once a muddy track, was now a firm, packed lane. He carried no clipboard, no briefcase. He wore work boots and a heavy coat. He found Alera not at the house, but halfway up the second terrace, working with a team to drag a large, ice-felled oak. He approached slowly, waiting until she had finished the pull and had stopped to rest the team. The mules stood patiently, their sides heaving gently. Alera looked at him, her expression unreadable. She did not seem surprised to see him. "Miss Gable," Renshaw said. His voice was quiet, stripped of its former confidence. He looked from her to the mules, then up at the immense, patient work that lay ahead on the higher slopes. He gestured vaguely at the repaired first terrace below them, where the winter rye was now a vibrant green. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, unadorned, and clearly difficult for him to say. It was not an apology. It was an admission of a fundamental error in perception. Alera nodded once, accepting the statement as a fact. She gave one of the mules a pat on its broad neck. "I don't understand," Renshaw said, and it was a genuine question. "My analysis, the numbers, they all said this was impossible. The energy expenditure, the feed costs, the sheer man-hours. It shouldn't be viable." Alera turned her gaze from the mules to the hill itself. She thought for a moment, not of how to answer him, but of how Silas would have answered. He would not have used abstract concepts like resilience or sustainability. He would have spoken of the work itself. "You count the cost of the feed," she said, her voice low and even. "But the hay and oats are grown here. You count the hours we work, but you don't count the hours your tractors sit broken or idle. A mule that's resting is still making fertilizer. A tractor that's resting is just rusting." She pointed with her chin to the ground beneath the mule's hooves. "Your machines compact the soil. They kill it. Every pass makes the ground harder. The water runs off, taking the soil with it. Here," she nudged a patch of earth with her boot, "the ground stays alive. Their hooves are small. They aerate the soil. The water sinks in. The work they do to repair the hill also makes the hill healthier. They are part of the system, not a force acting on it." She looked him directly in the eye. "The math is simple. They eat what the land grows. They power the work that keeps the land healthy. The land becomes more productive, so it can feed them better. It's a circle. Your way is a straight line that runs from a fuel truck to a bank, and the storm showed how easy it is to break that line." Renshaw was silent. He was a man who dealt in complex systems, in flowcharts and projections. But he had never encountered a system as elegant and self-contained as the one she described. He had been trained to see the farm as a factory, a place where raw materials were converted into commodities. Alara saw it as an organism, a living thing that had to be nurtured, not just exploited. He stayed for another hour, watching them work, asking quiet, practical questions. He learned about the different types of harnesses, the function of a single tree versus a double tree, the vocal commands used to guide the teams. It was a language he had never known existed, the language of a technology he had dismissed as dead. When he left, he did not just have a new appreciation for Alara Gable. He had a new framework for understanding the land. Back in his office at the university, he did not throw away his old report. He wrote a new one, an addendum. In it, he detailed the events of the storm and the role Alara's farm had played. He analyzed the closed-loop energy economy of her system, coining the term legacy agricultural resilience to describe it. He argued that the state should not be subsidizing only high-yield, high-risk farming, but should also create programs to support and study these older, more durable models. His report, initially met with skepticism, began to circulate among the more forward-thinking agronomists and economists. It was the beginning of a small, but significant, systemic change in how the institution viewed the relationship between land, energy, and food. He had learned the lesson, and now he was trying to teach it. By the following autumn, the Mules were no longer a symbol of eccentricity. They were a landmark. The first 5 terraces of Silas Creek Hollow were fully restored, their stone walls rebuilt, their gentle slopes covered in a patchwork of oats, clover, and winter wheat. The sight of the mule teams working on the hillsides had become a familiar, respected part of the local geography. They were no longer remarkable. They were simply true. The quiet, steady jingle of their harnesses was now a sound of permanence, a rhythm that had returned to the hollow after a long absence. The new normal settled in quietly. The men at the co-op now spoke of Alara with a profound and unshakable respect. They talked about the breeds of her mules, the weight of the stones they could haul, the quiet competence of her grandniece. They asked her advice about drainage and soil retention. She had not sought their approval, but she had earned it in the most undeniable way possible. Her success was now part of the local lore, a story that would be told for generations. Lena had become the keeper of the knowledge. She had spent the year at Alara's side, absorbing not just the practical skills of a teamster, but the deep, underlying philosophy of the hollow. She learned to read the weather in the clouds, to identify the health of the soil by its smell, and to understand the subtle, individual personalities of all 80 mules. One cool evening in October, a year after the work had begun, Alara handed Lena the oldest of Silas's ledgers, the one from 1920. "It's time you started your own," Alara said. Lena took the heavy book. She sat at the old roll-top desk and opened it to the first blank page. For a long time, she just looked at the clean, ruled lines. Then she picked up a pen. She did not write about the storm or the vindication. She wrote about the work of that day. October 12th, 1983. Move the team of Luke and Gabe to Terrace 6. Soil is thin on the west end. Needs more organic matter. Hauled 3 stone boats of composted manure from the barn. Silas was right about Jude. He still pulls lazy on the left trace. She was not just recording data. She was entering into a conversation that spanned generations. She had truly understood the lesson. The knowledge was now hers to carry forward. The legacy of Silas Creek Hollow was not in the restored terraces or the herd of working mules. It was in the continuation of the principle. It was the understanding that the oldest solutions are sometimes the most resilient, that true efficiency is not about speed but about endurance. Some things did not become obsolete. They just waited patiently for people to remember why they were necessary.